Hypixel Skyblock launched on June 11th, 2019, exactly 4 days before my birthday. And only 3 days later, big YouTubers such as ThirtyVirus made their start only 3 days after this day, posting their very first Hypixel Skyblock video, not knowing that it would change their channel and their life forever. However, that's not where my story starts. My profile started in July of 2023. We had just come off of a prison server, and we thought about playing something new. After watching some old Technoblade videos as his birthday just passed, we thought, hey, why not try out Skyblock? At first, I was actually very against this idea. I didn't enjoy Skyblock. I thought it would be too confusing and there would be way too many things to do. Even just watching Technoblade's videos, I couldn't actually comprehend how he kept all of that information together. It seemed like a bit too much at the time, and honestly, I didn't enjoy it. However, as I grew and the more I played, the more I actually wanted to learn about Skyblock. Now, this was mainly for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons being is that I was playing with my friends, which actually meant that I could, well, play with them. I wasn't playing alone, so me learning new things about the game and playing with them felt fun. However, one thing that I never really learned is exactly what the goal of the game was. I mean, even now as I'm recording this, I'm not 100% sure what the goal of Skyblock is, really. I mean, the progression in it is fun, but there's no end goal, or is there? You see, one thing that I discovered when playing Skyblock is that, at least in my eyes, technically, there is an end goal. I'm going to share what that goal is with you at the end of this video. Welcome to my profile journey, my progression through Skyblock, and my story. Now, I don't have footage of the beginning and of the early game on my main Skyblock profile, so I'll use this footage from another video instead. Breaking the tree and then building to the nether portal is pretty much the same beginner Hypixel Skyblock experience for everyone. After all, when you don't know the game, it's not like there's much else to do. Then, after you talk to Jerry and inspect the cobblestone minion, you're finally free to go through the nether portal. It's around this time where the player is overloaded with information. And so was I during this time, because I didn't know what I was looking at. It was like a whole new world had just opened in front of me, which of course it had. However, to prevent the player from getting completely overwhelmed with information, Hypixel added objectives, the first one being to talk to the 12 villagers around the central hub. This is seemingly done as a sort of tutorial, and Hypixel is actually very good at doing this to establish order. This is even prominent in some of the other areas in the game. While I didn't notice this myself, when playing with my friends, aka beginners, one thing I noticed is that they always seem to notice and look at the map when they first start off. This is another way that Hypixel aims to sort of maintain order. You see, the whole fantasy of Skyblock is that it's on an island, so they show you a map that, regardless of how absurd the other regions in the game are, that's all they are. They're floating islands. Everything on the game is presumed to be happening on a floating island. It also explains its own mechanics really well by prompting you immediately with leaflet armor, an absurd crafting recipe for an entirely new and diverse way to use armor and custom enchants. It also has this big, bold, glowing text whenever you discover a new area. This is clearly prompting the player to show them that this is an important area in the game and that they should explore further to find other areas like it. I should also mention that the Skyblock menu is probably the first thing that players would interact with, since you spawn on an island with nothing else in your inventory apart from a nether star. After talking to the villagers where you learn about mana abilities, Skyblock level, the stats, and even more, you're finally done with the unofficial tutorial of Hypixel Skyblock. In order to commemorate this, they actually give you Skyblock XP, to let you know that this will be your main progression system as the game goes on. Now that the game has explained to the player the core basics of the game, it gives the player an objectives prompt on the right side of the screen under the scoreboard. Now, these are just the quests from the quest log, but it teaches the player that, hey, there are still systems that you need to get accompanied with and accustomed to in order to not only progress through the game, but to understand how to play it. At this point in the experience, depending on which NPC the player talks to next, will actually decide the skill that they next work on. For example, talking to the blacksmith, like in this case, will let you start progressing through mining, or as it was in my case, talking to the lumberjack will actually begin your progression with combat. For any new player, mining progression will probably look like what you're seeing on the screen right now, and combat will just equate to fighting zombies with a rogue sword in the graveyard. At one point in your progression through a certain skill, you're able to actually travel to another island that isn't the hub, and usually this island will specialize in whatever skill you're doing. For example, in this instance it was the gold mine, which specializes in, well, mining. However, for combat it would be the spider's den, where you fight spiders to increase your combat level. Usually these islands have a level requirement that is specific to their specialty. For example, the gold mine has a mining level requirement of 1, or the deep caverns having a mining level requirement of 5. The interaction with the carpenter is kind of nonsensical. I mean, they introduce you to a new system where you can unlock a new skill, and it makes it seem as if the player will be able to do this in the future. However, you're only able to do this once more in the future, making this kind of a weird system to teach. Despite there being one on the private island, this wheat minion in the hub is actually the first time the player is properly educated about minions, such as minion upgrades like the compactor and the budget hopper, and even its own special item being the bread. This moment in the hub where the player farms all the wheat and then immediately gets hit with the reward of their farming level increasing rapidly is a key moment in the game. The adrenaline rush, the dopamine hit immediately gets the player hooked. This is sort of where the addiction begins in a way. You want to do it more, and you see that it feels easy. In fact, this is probably why a lot of players choose mining or farming as one of their main skills that they level up, because it's quick, it seems quick, and it seems easy. I feel like this clip shows a very good point about the Hypixel Skyblock experience that I wanted to talk about. Not every starter player is the same. I mean, for example, some players look up a tutorial or a video on the game to see if they should even spend their time playing it in the first place. And I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I think you can do this for all games. However, some players might start off and go to the auction house. Say, for example, if they wanted to do mining. They might check for an armor set that is designed for mining. However, in this clip, for some reason, it didn't even cross my mind to do. Even though I knew that there was a mining set specifically made for this part of the game, and instead I just defaulted to going to the person which actually sold you armor. Again, there's nothing wrong with buying armor from Rosetta, it's just interesting the diverse experience. The introduction of cat to the player is super important. 1, it not only teaches them that pets have different rarities, but 2, it teaches them the importance of pets in Skyblock. I personally believe there are 2 types of players in Skyblock. 1, the people who don't care about pets at all, or 2, the people who want to collect all of them. Now, regardless of which kind of player you are, everyone can agree, at least in some respect, pets are extremely important to the game. Regardless of what area of the game you're doing, you're going to need a pet for that area. You see, the struggle in this area of the game is a direct result of the previous decision made. Choosing to buy armor from Rosetta instead of going to the auction house and buying lapis or glassite armor, or even the miner set, is exactly what results in the struggle here. And later on, when the player acquires glassite armor in the dwarven mines, they'll look and see, hang on, there's no requirement. I could have just been using this earlier on. However, I wonder if this is perhaps a psychological issue. What I mean by this is that the player believes that they're not progressed enough to even be looking at different armor in the auction house other than what they directly have access to. So in that case, they just don't bother. This footage here is also another consequence and also kind of a commentary on the entire Skyblock experience. You see, in this mining area right now, this is the first time I leveled up my combat level in the whole game, despite the fact that there is a quest given to you by the lumberjack specifically designed to do this. By fighting zombies in the graveyard, you can get your combat level up to, well, even 3 quite easily, to be honest. And going to the weaponsmith in the hub actually allows you to purchase swords which do extra damage to undead mobs and spiders. However, due to the fact that we chose to focus on the mining skill, we didn't even bother to think about combat progression as a whole. I mentioned that this is a commentary on Skyblock because not balancing your skills could end up leading to things like this, where you hit a roadblock and need a specific skill level for a certain requirement in the future, which you just don't have because you never did it earlier. It's only at this point that I realized that I made a mistake a couple times earlier by saying it was the lumberjack who gives you the combat quest when it's actually the bartender. It's just that they're in such a similar area, I got the 2 NPCs mixed up. This section is where the player unlocks the Park Island. This island is supposedly meant to be for foraging because, well, the lumberjack gives you the quest for it, and when you finish the quest, you unlock the park. It has a foraging level 1 requirement which is quite low, so it appears as if it should be the beginner island for foraging. However, to the player's surprise, it's actually the only foraging island that you have. I believe this is the only island type of its kind, as every other island for every other thing has a subsequent island which follows. Even fishing, actually you can fish in almost every island, so that one's a bit special and different. However, almost every single skill type has its own unique set of islands which you can traverse, and the skill ceiling gets higher and higher for each one, allowing for natural progression. Except foraging. This is where the player finally starts learning combat, and it sets a precedent for things like crit damage, crit chance, and the player's overall damage. It really shows the player how combat progression works in the game, and how it's probably one of the most important, if not the most important stats in the game. Because in all areas of the game, you will always come up against a stronger mob, whether that be fishing or mining. This area is sort of towards the end of the player's tutorial experience of Hypixel Skyblock. You go to the community center and you talk to Clerk Seraphine, who explains to you about the mayor elections, tells you about Elizabeth in the community shop, and about the community projects. This is also where you have a chance to actually see the mayors and the perks and the voting system. This is actually a very good end to a tutorial, as the mayor election only happens once every 5.5 days, and it has an impact for an entire Skyblock year, every mayor having a different perk for a different skill or progression type in the game. I say that this is a good end to the tutorial because this is a passive system, meaning that the player doesn't actively need to do anything to make this happen. It just happens. Of course, the player can participate in the election if they choose to, they just don't have to. As long as they just simply pay attention to the elections and the decisions being made by the player base, they should overall be fine with regardless of what happens. And in a lot of cases with new players, it might not even affect them at all. As this marks the end of the tutorial, the player must now make a choice. When I started off my journey, I pretty much logged in, I did all of the basic NPC quests that they asked, I talked to all the villagers and explored the hub. Then I logged off for the night. The next time I would log into Hypixel Skyblock, I would have to make a choice. What am I going to do next? Of course, there are other quests you can do. You can search for the fairy souls in the hub, you can talk to more NPCs, and you can do the other quest progression lines from the other areas. However, one of the main things that most players will do is pick a skill and stick to it. This is purely because of the fact that it's very hard to work on a lot of things at the same time in Skyblock, and at the beginning of the game it doesn't seem that useful. I explained earlier that there are direct consequences to not doing this, but that is from the perspective of a player who's already in late mid-game, and since now the ordinary player has to make a choice, they'll probably do one of three things. One, they'll start with mining, they'll start with combat, or they'll start with farming. This is because those are the three skills that you're most prompted to pursue. There is fishing, however you don't actually do any fishing for the tutorial area of Skyblock. Even though there are fishing spots in the hub, the game never directly tells you to do this, you're just supposed to figure it out yourself. Now that the player has to make an active choice as to what they're going to do next, how they should make that decision is sort of ambiguous. What I mean by this is that, again, the game doesn't directly prompt you into which direction you should be going or what you should be doing next. The next step that the player will most likely do is attempt to get to Skyblock level 7 to unlock the bazaar, because it's one of the main things in the Skyblock level that you actually unlock. And it's still an area in the hub that is fairly central, that is completely inaccessible to you. However, after this, it's not very clear what the player should do or where they should go. This is where the real journey of Skyblock begins. Now, the next time that I logged on, I decided that my main progression system was going to be through combat. I already knew that the one way to do this was to fight the mobs at the very bottom of the obsidian quarry, as they gave the most mining XP. Of course, I didn't know any other methods at the time, and I thought it would just be the easiest to do because, well, you just hit things and they die. Of course, I was going to have to get better armor, which is why I farmed lapis zombies in order to drop lapis armor, and then went down and was able to kill them. As to how I made money early on, I just sold all the extra pieces that I got from the lapis armor and any extra minor pieces that I got, either to the AH or the NPC. However, the grind for combat level was taking quite a long time. I even remember asking people in the chat in the obsidian quarry, hey, how do you level up combat quickly? It's taking a long time, and they basically replied to me the bestiary. When I looked up stuff about the bestiary, I realized that the bestiary at a high level gives you 1 million combat XP per. So when I attempted to do that by killing spiders and whatnot, I found out that actually getting to level 24 of the bestiary was a very difficult thing to do. Now, you might be asking, why am I trying to get so far in the bestiary? It's because I was trying to unlock all the areas of the game, i.e. the Crimson Isle, which used to be a combat level 24 requirement. In seeing how difficult of a task I had started, I pretty much gave up. I logged off for the day after doing a bunch of combat and upping my combat level to something along the lines of 13 or maybe even 14, and I just logged off and I gave up. I was like, you know what? I can't be bothered anymore. It took a few days, but then I did something that would redefine my Skyblock profile forever. I looked up a progression guide on YouTube. Specifically, the progression guide that I watched was this one by ThirtyVirus. The guide was posted almost exactly 1 year before I started playing, and even though that wasn't ideal, it was actually the only thing I could use because, as it turns out, back then there really wasn't that many progression guides on the game. This is actually my first ever clip that I have in Skyblock. I use the word clip loosely because I wasn't even supposed to technically be recording on Skyblock. I was actually testing to see if my OBS worked for the first time, because this is also the first quote-unquote clip that I have on this PC as a whole. It was the first time I'd used OBS, so this is a perfect clip. As you can see in the clip, I actually have the cobblestone generator that ThirtyVirus showed in the video on the right, and you can kind of see my island at the beginning. You can also see that I didn't have any mods, and that I also probably had just sold the rock pets, because due to my purse, I know for 100% fact I was not making that much money at the time. There's actually even further proof that I watched that specific video, because you can find a comment from me under that video voicing my frustrations as to how long it actually took me to get the legendary rock pet, because I was breaking cobblestone for maybe 2 to 3 days, and it was really annoying and really jarring. Of course, it's not like that's all I wanted my Hypixel Skyblock experience to be, but I thought it was a necessary step in progression since it would allow me to get the most money. However, after I got the money, it dawned on me how much inflation there was in Skyblock, because the booster cookie had gone to what was previously 3 million all the way up to 6 million, almost 7 at this point. And the god potion had also tripled in value, going from 500,000 coins to 1.5 million coins. And even to this day now, as of recording this, it's around 2.25 million, which isn't too big of an increase, but you get the idea. The next day after I spent my money, I decided to go into dungeons with some of my friends. Apparently. As you can see, I wasn't very good and we were struggling to kill pretty much anything. At this point, I was just using the aspect of the dragons and aspect of the end, along with rogue sword and some other stuff. In fact, in this clip, you can actually see me opening up my inventory, which makes absolutely no sense. You can see that I didn't keep my arrows in the quiver. I had arachne fragments and a cow head from when I used to do arachne for early game money, because back then you would sell an arachne's fang to the auction house for 500k per, and that's how you'd make a lot of money, not including the string that you would get from arachne in general. I also have my dungeon orb and for some odd reason a snow minion on me. It's very evident that I wasn't aware that personal storage was even a thing, or maybe I did know but mine was too full. You can also see that I was wearing young dragon armor back then, because it was the only armor that I really knew that I could use properly. As you can see in this clip, we were struggling to even kill a lost adventurer, and there were 3 of us. Also, a reminder that this is actually entrance 4. As you can also see, we were running 2 berserks and 2 healers as our composition of classes, which of course isn't optimal, but this is still all part of the Hypixel Skyblock experience. In early game dungeons, no one really knows about different team compositions. However, also in early game dungeons, nor does it really matter. The struggle with these lost adventurers on the entrance floor is very reminiscent of something I said earlier, is that just because you have the requirement to do something does not necessarily mean that you should be doing it at that requirement level. For example, I can almost guarantee that I had either combat level 15 or 16, which is enough to unlock dungeons. However, that does not necessarily mean that I should be playing dungeons. As you can see, my gear was the issue. And also, it would have been nice to have an extra combat level or 2. In some respect, I still kind of missed that early game kind of goofiness to dungeons. Even with the puzzle rooms where you're not really sure what you're quite doing yet, and there's no rush to get it completed just as long as you get it done. In the current climate, everything is a rush and downtime is the one thing you're trying to minimize. However, in early game dungeons, you're just trying to get through the game. As in this clip, as you can see, the reason why I clipped it in the first place was because we had this funny moment in the puzzle room where I went down early and the gates and then ended up getting stuck because not all of the gates were opened at the same time. Now, should I have done this? Probably not, but at the time I just thought it was fun and I remember having fun doing it. Moving away from dungeons, I think this clip perfectly encapsulates the beginning of the Hypixel Skyblock experience in regards to mining. You see, I'm mining in the Dwarven mines with a Pico Nimbus and a Griffin pet, because I didn't have a Mithril Golem pet to use, and in fact, I didn't even know it existed. Back then, when I started the game, actually I didn't know anything about pets, or anything at all in general, which is why I think I only had 2 or 3 pets at the time, and all of them were to do with combat. You can also see that this was the very beginning of my mining journey, as I only had about 600 mithril powder. I probably hadn't even upgraded anything in the heart of the mountain. In my personal opinion, these were some of the moments that made Skyblock the best and the most fun to play, was this early stage of progression. Because it didn't take much to progress through the game, you just played it at your own pace, and whatever you did, you did. It's also probably why I have so many hours on my profile, but it feels like I've made such little progress in those hours, is because, as you can see, in the early stages of the game, I had no idea what I was doing. This clip right here confuses even me in my own stages of progression. I say this because I clearly had 15 million in my purse, however, I didn't choose to get a better pet or armor upgrade or anything. They just sat in my purse and just stayed there. In fact, I don't even think I had a booster cookie active when this was going on, so especially in the Dwarven mines, I could have very easily died and lost all that money. I frankly don't know where I got this money from, considering the previous day I only had 2 million. Perhaps I was wrong in my previous clip stating that I sold the rock pets by this point. Perhaps this is when I would have sold the rock pets. I feel like this clip shows off pretty well that without a minimap or any mods to guide you, the Dwarven mines is actually quite large and can be quite daunting for a new player, especially considering the fact that I had to be escorted by one of my friends, who we'll call Batman for now. This clip was filmed almost 24 hours on the dot after the last clip. Apparently I decided to go back to gathering combat XP down here in the Obsidian Quarry by killing these miner zombies. Why I was doing this instead of killing the Glacier Walkers, which I clearly had access to, I still don't quite know. And you can also see that I still have 15 million in my purse, so being in an area where there is combat is not the smartest decision. So for some reason this clip apparently completely got corrupted and I didn't find out until just now. But you can clearly see that, of this freeze frame anyways, that I had 9,000 coins in my purse, which meant that I probably put my other coins, my 15 million coins, in the bank. You can also see that I'm up top actually killing the treasure hoarders. Now, killing the treasure hoarders used to be a very good money making method, especially early game, because they dropped Starfall, which actually sold for quite a bit of money, and you could do this pretty efficiently. Of course, back here I didn't have the Aurora Staff, which is the recommended method, but it was still how I made my early game money. This clip was recorded only 3 hours after the previous clip, or what you could call a clip, I guess. I chose to include this clip actually for 2 main reasons. One of them being this is the first time I found out about the experimentation table, and the second clip being that you can tell by my inventory that this is when I first used Badline Client. Now, using mods was actually kind of what opened up my eyes to Skyblock, because now, to me anyways, the game just felt a lot more playable than my previous experiences. There was actually a bit of a gap between the previous clip and this clip, which is a 10-day gap, and for some unexplicable reason I also turned off the mods, so I'm no longer using Badline Client in this clip. But I feel like this clip also denotes a very common experience with a lot of Skyblock players. In fact, I think every single Skyblock player can relate to this. Running around the hub, jumping around aimlessly, for absolutely no reason. You're not doing anything, you're not actively making any progress in the game, you're not making money while you do this, you're just doing it because you are. I can't really find an exact reason for this. I mean, granted I was having a conversation with my friends during this clip, but what is the point of me running around in circles instead of me doing anything? I feel like jumping around the hub and just running around aimlessly has its own appeal to it that every single Skyblock player does. We just don't quite know why. This clip shows the progress that I'd made on my island from the previous one. I now have a slime minion and I also have snow minions. I also have redstone minions for the accessory bag collection. And I made a little cage where I could kill the mobs for the bestiary levels. The massive long bridges with snow on them were actually me testing out a builder's ruler. to see how it works, and the reason why it has snow on them was because I was testing out the snow shovel, where when you right click you add snow on the floor. And here is me killing the treasure holders effectively this time with an Aurora staff, because I would have bought one by this point. It's also a testament to how difficult it is to find things out and make progression steps like this one without directly being told to do so. For example, I remember when farming treasure holders I saw someone else doing this one tap method by just killing them instantly, so I had to look into that to discover the Aurora stuff. The only guide I had looked up till this point was the progression guide. I never used any other guide for anything. At least not yet. This clip was 5 days after the previous one, and there's a lot to unpack here. So one thing we can see is that I'm on floor 3 right now, which means I've made some progression through dungeons. The second thing we can see is that despite the fact that there's no rarity indicator in the hotbar, I know that the first item is a Bonzo stuff. I remember that this was when I had made my swap to mage. The item I'm holding is not a frozen scythe, it's actually a sugarcane hoe, for reasons which I will not understand. The third thing that we can notice is the fact that the time that has elapsed is 17 minutes, which means we've been running around this floor attempting to clear it for 17 minutes. What I'm doing in the clip is actually trying to find the secret in the room, because again, I wasn't using mods, even though I very easily could have. This clip is kind of a special one for me because this is the first time I've ever dropped the recom. In fact, this is actually the first time anyone in our friend group had dropped any RNG drop from any dungeon floor. Which was why it was so exciting, especially considering the fact that we didn't actually know what a recom did at the time, which we discovered only through reading the description by holding this one. And I just thought this was a special moment that I would share with you guys. I'm going to use this clip of me doing fishing for one of the first times ever in my whole life of playing Skyblock in order to actually talk about the previous clip. I actually think this is a very important moment in the Hypixel Skyblock experience. As you can see, my co-op member and my friend was actually wearing 3/4 Shadow Assassin and a Zombie Knight chestplate, which is recommended for a berserk of that level, and you can see that we had just about enough money to be able to afford the chest with the recom in it. Now at this point, we were already getting our way into progression, especially in dungeons, and this was only just the beginning. In fact, this recom was probably one of the jumpstarts which helped jumpstart our gear. As you can see at the time, I already had a legendary blue whale pet that I was using, so this wasn't actually an issue for me, and I finally learned how to use pets and what pets were. Although I was using the wrong pet, because if I was playing mage I should have been using the sheep, it actually did help me stay alive early on. I also feel like everyone has at least one of these moments at the very beginning of their Skyblock journey. Or I guess this was more towards the further beginning of my journey rather than the very beginning. I feel like everyone has this game-defining moment that wants to make them actually play the game more. It gives you that adrenaline rush and it gives you that dopamine. You want to continue playing and now you have another reason to play. Now, even though this clip is once again broken, this clip actually signifies kind of towards the beginning or more so towards the middle of my farming journey, because at some point I fell in love with farming and I realized you can actually make fairly good money from farming, or at least what I considered to be good money anyways, because to me a couple million was pretty decent at the time. I felt like a couple million an hour was the best you can do in terms of money making, which couldn't be further from the truth. Especially considering the fact that around the time that I joined, the Rift update actually came out. So in fact, I could have been doing the Rift this whole time, which I hadn't even touched until way later on. But something else you can see in my hotbar is that I actually finally turned on my mods again. And you can see in the bottom left and in the middle of my screen and in the top right that I was once again using Badline. I don't know why I turned it off in the first place, but I'm glad I was back to using it. Now, even though you can't see it properly because for some reason I recorded this in windowed mode and the clip cropped weirdly, at this point, this is when I was finally starting to develop my understanding of Skyblock. You can see in my hotbar, I had a Maddox bat phone and the stick that is in my inventory is one of the wands of healing. I don't know specifically which one, but it's the lowest rarity one. And you're not able to see it right now, but I'm actually using a legendary level 100 sheep pet. That means I was still playing mage, but now I was pairing it with some more support items, which is what I should have been doing from the beginning. Between the last clip and this clip, there is a 3-month gap time period and a lot, and I mean a lot, has changed. One of the first things that happened is I ditched farming altogether and I took all of the money I made from farming and I spent it all on dungeons. More specifically, I saved up for a Felthorn Reaper. Now, to clarify, I bought the Felthorn Reaper when it came out, As in literally 2 days after the sword came out, I bought it. This was shortly after the Dungeons Overhaul update where they buffed Berserk a whole bunch and they changed a lot of the other classes such as Healer. Berserk however got the biggest upgrade as they got an extra reach, speed boost, and the way they hit was completely different now, so instead of just hitting directly in front of them, they hit in a cone and got a larger swing radius. The Felthorn Reaper was introduced to actually be accompanied with this change, as it also gave you extra swing radius, but it also had a unique right click which dealt a bunch more damage. The sword was now comparable to the Shadow Fury in terms of damage, and even to some people maybe the Giant Sword. Okay, not really the Giant Sword, who are we kidding? It's never gonna touch the Giant Sword. But it was still a very, very good and a solid Berserk weapon. As you can see in this clip, I'm playing F6 now and I'm very confidently running around and killing things. I remember the very first day when I got the Felthorn Reaper and maxed it out, I also borrowed my co-op member's Shadow Assassin armor, which he had a full set of at this point. I used that Shadow Assassin armor to test it out and it turned out I could pretty much solo F5. This was a very, very large jump because considering before, I could barely even play floor 3 without getting one tapped by anything since I was using Wise Dragon armor. And now I could very confidently just walk through all of the rooms by myself. That paired with the fact that now I had the dungeon map in the top left corner and I could see all of the secrets when actually playing dungeons because I now had my mods turned on. Now that I'd optimized the gameplay, this is when I started to make real progression into the game. Just to clarify, by this point I was no longer using Shadow Assassin armor. I was actually using full Necron armor, similarly to my co-op teammate. And also my other two teammates, the healer and the tank, they were actually using Goldar armor. We had an F7 completion by that point, which I had to pay a little bit of money for, but it was basically nothing compared to the amount of money I would spend in the future. And especially considering the fact that this armor and this weapon is what was going to carry me through the rest of the game, I thought it was a perfectly just investment. In regards to the overall Hypixel Skyblock experience, this is actually comparable to any player that's still playing the game and making progress in their chosen skill. For example, in mining, it might be getting a full set of Soro armor and a DRX 555 drill in order to be able to mine better and have more mining fortune. It's not the max possible gear you could have, however, it's one of the many options of the game. Or for example, fishing armor getting all the way up to shark scale. This is the sort of mid-game progression area of the game, where each player essentially excels at one of the skills that they've chosen. For mine, it was always going to be combat from the very beginning, because that's what I thought the game was about, and that's how I personally chose to play the game. It's why this game has a sort of RPG aspect to it, in the sense of you can play however you want and develop yourself and your character however you want, and your progress is kind of your own progress. It's also why these kinds of things work. As you saw at the very beginning, I started with nothing and I didn't have an understanding of the game. I wasn't even using an Aurora stuff to kill the treasure hoarders. However, now I'm using full Necron armor and a Felthorn Reaper in F6, which is working perfectly fine, and I have a healer and a tank in my party, which again, perfectly fine. I've also swapped to Berserk at this point because I just figured Mage would not work. In terms of the overall experience for the general player, I'd say this is pretty on par. It's not that there isn't anything else left to figure out, it's just that the stage where I was at, it was pretty good. Something else which I wanted to show off in this clip that apparently I hadn't even realized is so much time had actually gone by that apparently I had already dropped my first scroll and my first Necron handle up until the point of this clip. As you can see, my purse is currently at 1 billion, and I remember when I dropped my first scroll, I sold it immediately, and when I dropped my first Necron handle, I also sold it immediately, bringing me up to 1 billion. It's most likely how I was able to afford the armor and well, basically everything else. I remember very specifically though, having to grind farming for the Felthorn. I don't seem to recall that I've already dropped the handle by this clip, but here we are. While I don't have footage of my first ever time doing F7, I do have this footage of me playing F7, which of course is a lot after my very first time, and because I've already dropped the handle and a scroll from doing F7. However, you can see from this clip that despite that, the enters that we were having were around 7 minutes, which is really bad, but you have to consider how low kata I actually was. I'm basically the guy whose distant relative passed away and I just inherited a bunch of money. I never knew what to actually do with all of that money that I had, so I just never spent it. I just kept it in my purse because it looked nice? I don't know. But you can evidently see that we weren't very good and our time was actually horrible. But we were still able to play F7, which was the important part. So the only thing we could do from here is progress in terms of our skill. In this clip, you can see my island from a lot closer, and you can see now that it's a lot more improved. For example, I have a pretty much full slime minion setup, at least as many as I could get, and all the rest of the minions are there pretty much just for collection. This is how RNG carried I really am. Here you can see that I have 6.7% on the handle meter. However, in this clip, when I swap my ender chest page, you can see that I actually already have another scroll. Paired with the fact that I've already dropped a handle and a scroll, this is actually quite insane. Now, in terms of clips, this is where it gets kind of tricky. I didn't actually clip Skyblock at all or record it really on OBS almost ever, so it's really tough to say exactly what happened when. However, what I can tell you is that I don't have any clips of this happening, but I do have screenshots. On the 14th of May, 2024 is when I dropped the handle and the final piece needed to finally craft my fully scrolled Hyperion. In the previous clip that I just showed you, you saw that I already had one of the scrolls. That means in between that date, which is the 23rd of April, and the 14th of May, I not only dropped 2 more scrolls, but I also dropped the handle. Now, to give myself a little bit of credit here, I did 500 runs in order to drop the handle. When I dropped my second handle, I was at 772 runs. According to me, it took me 5 straight days of grinding, and my tank level skyrocketed because at that point, I'd already bought gold or armor. If anyone doesn't know, one of my final goals of Hypixel has always been to be able to play all 5 roles in Master Mode. In this grind, my kata level skyrocketed to 39, which is only 4 levels less than what it is right now. It took me about 16 minutes to max out the entire Hyperion, meaning putting all the enchants on it, recomming at 5-star, and everything else. During this time, I also bought the Storm Armor because I didn't have Storm Armor. So that was when I also bought my full set of Storm Armor. Also when I maxed it out and put all of the gemstones on it. I also immediately museumed my Hyperion because I knew there was no way I was ever going to sell it. It was mine now. It was staying as mine. After this, on the 22nd of May, now granted it was midnight on the 22nd of May, but that was when I officially got my Juju shortbow. I got to Enderman 5 and I managed to buy a Juju shortbow and pretty much max it out as much as I could. Again, I wanted the Juju because I didn't have a good bow. I was just using the machine gun shortbow, and now I actually had a bow that did damage. Again, my end goal was to be able to play all roles in F7. This was clearly a very good stepping stone towards getting that goal. I remember after this period, I stepped away from Skyblock for a little bit. I didn't really have much of a reason to play. At the time, I felt kind of burnt out, especially from grinding dungeons so much, and especially considering the fact that after that, I still didn't stop grinding dungeons so I can help my other, well, co-op members. As a matter of fact, one of my co-op members dropped the handle around the same time I actually maxed out my Juju. However, during July, I managed to find my way back into the game, and the one thing that brought me back was actually the fact that I hadn't done any progression in mining. Okay, not any progression is harsh, but my mining progression was severely lacking. So in between the months of May and July, I pretty much grinded mining solely. I used all the money I had on whatever, just on mining. I started off with Sorrow Armor, which led all the way up to Divan's Armor, which I finally attained on the 18th of July in 2024. I should mention that the reason it took me so long was that I actually had the challenge from one of my friends to drop the entire Divan Armor set myself. That meant I got all the fragments and everything except for the worm membranes, basically myself. Now, the reason I didn't drop the worm membranes myself is because not only would that have taken me 300 years, but also I had to actually get to the fishing level where I could do it, and I hated fishing and she knew this. So she gave me the challenge to drop everything except for the worm membrane for the Divan Armor, which I then had to put in the forge, then wait, then put in the forge, then wait, and finally I got it. Now let's talk about the Hypixel Skyblock experience. This sort of mid-game is the most explosive time in a player's career. It's where they get the most items, it's where they start making the most progress in the game. Each step takes longer than early game, but it doesn't take nowhere near enough time to not justify doing it. For example, getting Divan's Armor did take a while, but it's not like it took 500 hours, and it's not like I was just getting one item, or one tiny stat boost out of it. It was an endgame set of armor. This is what mid-game is pretty much about, whether you're early mid-game or late mid-game. It's where you make the most developments, it's where you earn a whole lot of money, and now it feels like you're actually able to start playing the game. It's where you have the most fun playing the game because, well, there are some things which are very grindy, but you don't have to do them to play mid-game, because now is where you should develop your account. Now is when you start buying more items. This is what mid-game is about to the player. It is essentially the game telling you, hey, now you have the freedom of doing the harder quests because you have the reward from beating the early game. This is the reward that a lot of players miss out on, especially if they don't feel like they like the game at the very beginning, which is actually completely fair because to them it wouldn't be a reward, it would be more of a punishment. However, there is definitely something cyclical about Skyblock in that sense. I mean, you do this whole grinding thing, but you eventually end up at the same point. You still end up at the point where, great, I have now done grinding in order to be able to do more grinding. I will touch on that cyclical narrative in a little bit later. However, just for now, keep in mind that this is kind of the theme of Skyblock. The grind is always the grind, and that is just all there is. Now, this clip is taken on the 3rd of August, and it's pretty obvious to see what I'm doing. At this point, I had paid for a carry for Enderman 7, and I was able to finally craft the Terminator. I know that getting a carry is kind of frowned upon, because a lot of people argue that if you can't use the bow and if you don't have the requirements, you shouldn't be using it yet. However, I argue that Skyblock can be played however you want, because it's actually up to the player. In my personal opinion, getting a carry for something that you don't want to do, especially when it's as tedious as Slayers, is perfectly fine. Because not only is Enderman Slayer difficult, it's also annoying to do the same repetitive task over and over again. Only 3 days after this clip, I managed to pay for an M7 carry. Why I did this was because I figured out that the Dark Claymore and the Giant Sword actually cost the same amount of money, so I figured I would just buy the Claymore instead of the Giant Sword, as I thought it was actually better as a weapon. So I paid for an M7 carry and I managed to buy myself and max out a Dark Claymore. About 2 weeks after this was when there was speculated to be a huge mining update, which was then later confirmed. One of the main changes they made was that they changed the requirement of gold needed to mine in order to max out a G-Drag. It went down from 1 billion gold collection to 100 million gold collection. This was around in September. Because of this update, I wanted to find a golden dragon egg before the update came out. Now, unfortunately, I was kind of stupid to do this because I didn't realize in time that that was also everyone else's plan. I spent around 2.5 days straight just swapping lobbies in the Crystal Hollows while having all the items that I actually needed to purchase the golden dragon egg. You see, I could have easily gone to the auction house and bought it, but the prices were so inflated and I already had all the items necessary to buy one. It felt kind of pointless for me to buy it at an inflated price when I could have just found the egg myself. Now, golden dragon layers aren't exactly common. In fact, they're actually very rare. What's even rarer though is that you find a golden dragon layer that has all of the eggs, or at least has one, which is what I was looking for. Because of this, I remember recruiting one of my friends at the time, and we thought of some absolutely insane ideas to help us find golden dragon layers. For example, here is something that she came up with to help me mine in an absolute optimum pattern around the Crystal Hollows in order for me to find the golden dragon layer. I think the irony of this method is the fact that it actually did end up working, as not even an hour later, I ended up actually getting the golden dragon egg. Firstly, apologies for the clip being squished. I have no idea what happened. I've never seen these clips until now, so I had no idea it came out like this. This must be an OBS issue. I don't know why I did this. But secondly, this is actually a clip of me in the glassite tunnels maxing out or working towards maxing out my golden dragon pet. As you can see in the clip, it's only just an egg for now, but this was me essentially working on maxing it, as now I wanted to be able to play Archer, as I already had a Terminator, and the golden dragon was the next logical step. This clip was from when I finally got into the groove of dungeons. I felt like I could play the game, I was a lot more confident, and this was when I was still playing tank. However, I was clearing with the mage setup now, and I was very effective in actually clearing rooms, and I was getting more confident with secrets and puzzle rooms. I was even able to do orange room using ender pearls because I finally learned that you could use ender pearls in orange room. Although, of course, this clip is actually fairly recent in terms of relativity, so it's not that absurd to think that. However, still, I felt like it's a big progression step. These two next clips were both recorded in 2025, making them, apart from my own videos, the most recent clips I have of my own Hypixel Skyblock progression. In the first clip, I dropped the scroll on F7, which was crazy in itself, but then in the second clip, I actually managed to drop an ice spray, which is somehow twice as crazy because now I not only have another 300 mil, but I also have an ice spray. And this actually puts me into prime position towards actually getting and attaining more endgame gear. I want to quickly talk about a concept that I like to call player perception. Essentially what this means is how the player perceives the game and how the game actually plays. What I'm trying to say by this is that the term that I just used, endgame, is more so ambiguous than it is something that's set in stone. For example, some people would consider endgame someone who has max gear, whereas other people would consider someone who's endgame as someone who has all of the stats and everything maxed out. For example, someone who's able to do M7 is endgame. However, to others who might be higher Skyblock level, for example, and might have more collections and museum donations, he might still be in the mid game. I actually wouldn't say that there is a set in stone end game or late game. I would say that it's entirely dependent on the player's perception. For example, if you don't feel like you would want to play the game anymore after you get 1 billion coins in your bank, then that is for you end game. However, to another player who has 400 billion net worth, endgame might be to literally max out every single thing there is in the game, and literally the only new content that you have is when a new update drops for the game. I think player perception is very important to our game's overall health, and in Hypixel Skyblock, it's especially important when determining the player's own goals. I mentioned towards the beginning that someone should stick with their own goals and they should have a goal that they should work towards. Well, that still applies and is exactly what I mean. That goal is just now dependent on what stage of the game you perceive yourself to be in. It's still the same principle, it's just a different stage in the game. The only argument that can be made that the stages are set in stone is the Hypixel Skyblock in-game guide, because the guide is split up into different stages all the way up to expert, which some people might say is end game. However, I actually believe that the guide in Skyblock isn't there to set the stages in stone, rather than just a way to create progression through the game. It's a way to create momentum and flow, and in case the player is stuck, because again, there is a lot of things to do, it sort of gives them an objective to work towards that isn't direct, however is still just as instructive and helpful at the same time. I think the guide system is a very good system in its own in terms of helping the player to progress through the game and in order to give them something to work towards. However, I don't think it should be used as a guide in what determines the different stages of the game. In this section, the Hypixel Skyblock experience becomes very narrow because not many players get to this part of the game, so it's kind of difficult for me to give a specific progress report on what the specific Hypixel Skyblock experience is, considering I don't even think I'm in endgame myself, and there are very few players which actually reach what is the theoretical end game. This section of the game is kind of like a double-edged sword in a way. Basically, all of the bad habits that you built up over the beginning of the game are going to pile up now, and the other side of the blade is that now you have a chance to fix all of the bad habits you built up early on. For example, in the endgame dungeons or combat system, you might actually be missing some strength, purely because you never did foraging early on in the experience. Or perhaps you're missing accessories because you don't have the diamond tooth from trophy fishing because you never bothered to do fishing early on. Now in the end game is your chance to fix all of your early game mistakes. Now that you have all the money in the world, and now that you have all the gear in the world, and you have mastered one specific skill at least, you now have the freedom to basically pursue whatever skill you wish and max it out to its fullest potential. If you really wish, you can sell some of the gear that you already have and make your job easier. Of course, there is also the people who are on Iron Man. However, I still believe that everything I've said so far still applies to Iron Man, regardless of whether you're rich or not. This is about the experience of the people who are unexperienced. And the truth is that I don't think too many unexperienced players get to this stage in the game. In fact, a lot of the people who get to this stage in the game have already had an account, and this is their second account. They're restarting. Unfortunately, I don't have any way to prove this is the case. However, it just makes sense that when you have a lot of knowledge of the early game, it makes a lot more sense to restart and go back and retry some of the things you did wrong in order to get a better start, in order to launch for a better progression. One thing you may have noticed is how I talk about the Hypixel Skyblock experience throughout the video. In a lot of the early game, I was using words like the player to create generalization. However, later on in the mid game, I actually more so say I and my experience. This is what I did. This is because the further you progress through Skyblock, the more personalized of an experience you'll have. It's very hard for me to generalize at the mid-game stage of the game, considering some people might be wearing full Fermento armor, farming sugarcane for 10 hours on end, while others could be in the glassite tunnels. They could be doing commissions. Or others, like myself, might be in floor 7 or even master mode, farming that. It's actually sort of the opposite when it gets to endgame, because I feel like endgame can be sort of more generalized. Everyone is sort of trying to get to the same point, and at some point, everything becomes at a certain price where you can only buy it at a certain stage in the game. I know that sounded confusing, but what I mean is, for example, accessories like the Artifact of Control, you can only really buy it when you're endgame because no one has 5 billion just lying around to throw away on an artifact that only gives you 12 magical power. However, for an endgame player, those 12 magical power is actually very worth it, because it could make the difference of Skyblock XP between one level and another. You see, in the very late stages of the Skyblock experience, the whole game sort of revolves around collecting Skyblock experience. Essentially, that means collecting any leftover quests, any leftover collections, any leftover pretty much anything in the game that you have left to finish in order to collect Skyblock XP. One of the main things that players do is the museum. The museum is one of the largest progressions of Skyblock XP because higher sets of armor on which cost higher amounts give you a lot more Skyblock XP than armors which are actually cost way less. A lot of endgame players' museums will have something in the ballpark of a 10 billion appraisal because, well, they have pretty much every item in the game. At that point, there's not much else you can add. However, any collection that is left over or any NPC that is unspoken to, any Abathon contact that is left uncollected will be what their next goal will be. Even any item they haven't gotten yet, just to add it to the museum. For example, one thing a lot of endgame players struggle with, especially players who are playing on the Iron Man profile, they will struggle to collect the Divan alloy and the pendant of Divan. Now, both of those accessories cost in the billions, but the reason why is because they're extremely difficult to get. Even with one of them having an RNG meter, this was only recently added to the game. A lot of Iron Man players, especially late game, might not have a Divan's drill because, well, they never dropped an alloy. And even places like the Dark Auction can sometimes be exclusive to Iron Man players because sometimes people want to buy items to make a profit, and Iron Man players do not care about making a profit on the auction house, so they will overpay as much as they need in order to get it. Not to mention that along with completing 15 separate auctions in the Dark Auction, you will be awarded with another accessory, being the Seal of the Family. This is also another goal that Iron Man players have, so 75 million for a flower minion is a small price to pay in the grand scheme of things. I also want to try to look at the Skyblock experience from a different angle. I want to try to investigate it psychologically. What I mean by this is, for example, things like the sunk cost fallacy can definitely come into play here. The more time you spend on something, the more time you feel like you have to spend on something because you've already put so much time into it, you might as well see it through to the end. However, like I mentioned in Skyblock, there is no definitive end. Everyone feels like they can stop and quit whenever they're finished. But by the time they feel like they can get finished, another update drops, and then they add 300 things and maybe change 10 things on the way out. It becomes a very difficult psychological game for every Skyblock player who wants to continue playing the game. I mean, for me, I actually thought at the very beginning that I would quit the game when I hit 100 million coins. I always said when I hit 100 million coins, that's gonna be it, because at that point I'll be too rich and the game won't be fun. That was me not realizing how much more there was to the game. Then my goal was 1 billion coins, then it was to play max mage at F7, then it was to be able to play every role at F7, and now my goal is to be able to play and participate in M7. You see how goals change as the game evolves? I feel like it's actually a healthy habit to have goals that change, and every time you hit a new stepping stone, you now make a new goal. However, it's called a sunk cost fallacy for a reason. The fallacy being that if you feel like you're getting in way over your head and you feel like you're actually losing more than you are gaining, pulling the cord will always be better than sinking in even more time to try and see it through to the end. You made it to the end of the video. I've now talked about the entire Hypixel Skyblock experience from start to finish and told you what I thought about it. I also talked about my own progress and development along the way and how I personally progressed in the game. Now I will answer the question I set out to answer at the very beginning of the video. What is the end goal of Skyblock? This is my take on it. Hypixel Skyblock is a game that could last for tens of thousands of hours and still have more content in it to play. The game will always update, the game will always progress. The game is technically never ending. But in my opinion, the end goal is an individual's end goal. What I mean by this is that every single person will stop the game at some point. No one will play infinitely. Whether you quit next week, whether you've already quit today, whether you quit 2 years ago, or whether you will quit in 10 years. It doesn't really matter. The point is that Hypixel Skyblock is there to teach you important life skills. One of them being that no matter what, if you work hard at something, you will always see improvement. Now, that's not to say that you'll see success, but you will definitely see improvement, whether it be 1% improvement or whether it be 1000% improvement. Look back at all the progress you've made since day one. Look back at all the gear you've gotten, every single person you've interacted with, all of the things in your museum. Look back at all the gear in your ender chests. Look at your backpacks, the collections, the minions. Look at your skills. This is an amalgamation of your progress. This is an amalgamation of your hard work. It's also to the point that in this video, I didn't even mention all of my progress. I didn't even talk about the rift or any of my skills really, because to me, those were kind of external points that shouldn't need to be mentioned. Of course, as I progress in the game, I'm going to get better skills and everything. One of the end goals of Hypixel Skyblock is self-fulfillment. You see all the progress you've made, you look around, and whether you feel satisfied with it or not could probably dictate whether you continue going and playing the game or whether you want to log off. But one thing is for sure, you've worked hard and you've made progress. Whether you've only played 10 hours or whether you've played thousands of hours. It's also important to remember that regardless of how much someone played, the amount is always important. Could you imagine sitting at home all day doing literally nothing for 10 solid hours? No, you couldn't. Because the number of time, it doesn't feel realistic. But when you play Skyblock, 10 hours is like, it's alright. But it's a lot of time. So regardless of what you have and what stage of the game you're in, even if you personally feel like you're behind other players, you're not. You're moving at your own pace, and that's okay. That's also something Skyblock does really well, is it sort of allows us to move at our own pace. It's something that's kind of parallel to the real world, except not really. See, in the real world, in certain cultures and places, there's sort of expectations. You go to school at this age, you exit school at this age, you find a job at this age, you move out at this age, whatever it may be. It feels like there's always expectations and it might feel like you're always falling behind. However, in Skyblock, that's not necessarily always the case. Everyone moves at their own speed, and some people just get luckier than others. That's just the truth in Skyblock, and a lot of people accept that. There's also a lot of people who say that Skyblock is a waste of time. You know, you spend thousands of hours on pixels, you end up doing nothing with your life. What the hell are you doing? I have a different take on this, and I know this is gonna sound like an absolute loser mentality, but I personally think in life you need some things that will waste your time. As in, I think there are some things which are worth just turning your brain off for and playing, because otherwise it sort of feels like we're wasting our life if we're not having fun. So in a way, the things that waste your time actually don't waste your time, if that made sense. I feel like the end goal of Skyblock is definitely not only the journey itself, but also where you end up. As I said, you might stop playing soon, but you should have a sense of accomplishment. You have in fact achieved something. Your goal is the achievement in life that no matter where you go from now, whether you stop playing and maybe you get a really, really good job and you're no longer able to play, you at least can think to yourself, I have experienced this. This experience is something that I went through, and you'll have those memories forever. Well, maybe not forever depending on the memory, but you know what I'm trying to say. Hypixel Skyblock is a game for everybody. I feel like almost every single player will have a sense of accomplishment when they've left the game. I beat the tutorial. I got to experience all the different mobs. I got to wear full Divan's armor. Every single person will have a different experience and a different end goal. Imagine going back to you on day one when you played Hypixel Skyblock, when you first joined the server, and telling that person that they will achieve playing dungeons with the top players, that they will achieve Divan's armor, and they will achieve the peaks of mining, that they will achieve the ability to be able to fish out ridiculous creatures, that they will be able to shoot exploding horses out of a bazooka, what do you think they would say? I don't think they will tell you that's lame. I think they will tell you that's awesome. Of course, I'm not saying spend your entire life on Skyblock. The point I'm making is that it's not a bad thing, and the game actually does have an end goal. The end goal is what you take away from it. And I think that's quite beautiful, actually. And that is the Hypixel Skyblock experience. Thank you for watching.